Hello and welcome back to my channel What If Deku 2.0. Join us as we delve into the realms of fanfiction and fantasy, bringing you the best stories and discussions. Today, we're kicking off part 4 of our series, What If Deku Unleashed God-like Power Surpassing All? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is DripBayless from FanfictionNet. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. A scruffy, black-haired man in his early 20s took a puff of his cigarette as he meandered down the dark alleyway. He hated taking this shortcut home, especially with that lunatic with the blue fire going on a rampage lately. But it shaved 20 minutes off his trip, and he had a knife and some trigger to defend himself if he really needed to. Kicking a few loose stones under a dumpster, he walked right past the large receptacle, failing to notice the pair of golden eyes observing him closely from within the darkness of the dumpster. As he strolled further into the void, messy, matted blonde hair in two buns rose from within. Himiko Toga's slitted pupils narrowed even more as she hungrily watched the man. Her fingers were wrapped so tightly around the edge of the dumpster that they dented and crumpled the metal within her grasp. But she wasn't concerned about that at all. Before her was a perfect opportunity to satiate her thirst and satisfy her carnal desires. She could kill him right now. It would be so easy. She wanted so desperately to jump him, slash his throat, and plunge her knife into him until she was bathing in his blood. Then she could drink as much as she wanted and feel so warm and safe and whole. No, 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 no. She refused to give in. She wouldn't hurt anyone anymore. She was broken, and she needed to be fixed. If she couldn't be fixed, then she needed to be killed. There was no in-between. But fighting herself just to come to that thought alone was strenuous enough. Every single day was a constant struggle to maintain control of her faculties and battle through the withdrawals. Every single second, her brain would demand blood. Her heart would demand blood. Her own body would demand that she spill such beautiful, precious blood. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to unleash unholy slaughter and paint the city red. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She made her choice in Camino. She wouldn't give in to the urges, regardless of how badly she hungered. She held out hope that he'd come back and save her, pulling her out of the cracks she had fallen so far into. He'd be her guiding light back to sanity. Or he'd put her out of her misery. Either one was preferable to this existence. Slowly, she retreated into the dumpster, stirring some of the trash that lay underneath as she settled in for another unrestful night. Moments later, the head of a black cat emerged from the shadows beside the dumpster, and another set of slitted eyes scanned the area, this pair being a dull yellow. Those eyes landed on the back of the man nearing the end of the alleyway, completely oblivious to being observed by more than one person on his trek. The owner of the eyes inspected him intently, but when she determined that he wasn't the person she was looking for, she sighed. "Kiriniko, you all good over there?" came the voice of an older woman in her earpiece. "Yeah, just," she hesitated. "I thought I spotted him. This area's clear, too. He must have slipped away again. Damn it. Well, let's rendezvous back on the main road." "Copy, Miss Joke. I'm on my way over." Vanta did a final sweep of the alley before literally sinking back into the shadows. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. That had been the story of Nezu's life over the course of the academic year. If he wasn't engaging in a cold war with the HPSC and several proxy wars with the MLA, he was overseeing the education of hundreds of incredibly unique and interesting adolescent humans, each with their own individual backgrounds, hobbies, troubles, and connections with any and every given person. It wouldn't be out of the ordinary for a plentiful number of them to go through some sort of strife, some of which could even be horrendously complex and delicate situations. He'd expect that. Such was the nature of Sonder. So, naturally, it was only fitting that the bulk of the strife and craziness he had to deal with as principal centered around one particular group of students. Class 1A of the Hero course has had an absurdly memorable first semester for all the wrong reasons. If Nezu didn't have explicit confirmation from his fantastic protege that deities did, in fact, exist, then he would scoff at the notion that some high power was leveling 1A with as much terrible fortune as cosmically possible. Given his protege's description of the deity that inhabits his quirk's general disposition, Nezu could not rule out the possibility that the same being was pulling strings beyond their mortal understanding. And wasn't that just a wonderfully terrifying thought? Terrifying or not, it would be a welcome distraction from dealing with the latest predicament regarding 1A. The Aoyama family had been attacked at some point between the training camp raid and Aizawa and Inko's visit to their home. The two adults were dead, and their son was missing without a trace. The state of their burned, mangled corpses suggested that they both died in an explosion. But given that they were in entirely different places of the house, they clearly perished in separate explosions. That did not tell him where their son was, however. He would continue scouring any camera feed he could acquire a backdoor into legally or not and investigate any possible leads that he came across as much as he could. But he would unfortunately have to leave the rest to the police. Then there was the matter of Masahiro Ejiro. Quite an interesting case, indeed. The fact that a spy infiltrated his institution was both a grievous insult and a monumental failure on his part. One that he would see to never happening again while he was still breathing. He would be conducting very thorough highly invasive and ostensibly illegal background checks on every single student, teacher, staff member, and business affiliate of Yua High School. In the meantime, he had to investigate a little further into the suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of the Ejiro family. The official story was that, overcome with the grief and shame of their son being a spy for villains, the two parents took their own lives. Humans were strange creatures, and Nezu had not yet figured them out entirely, but he was certainly aware of their propensity to behave erratically when under extreme emotional duress. If not for Ejiro's sudden death while in custody, he would not have felt the need to look any further into the tragedy. However, the two Ejiro parents taking their lives within 48 hours of their son suddenly and inexplicably dying in his cell was a very big coincidence. Nezu did not believe in coincidences. He suspected that Ejiro was a loose end that needed to be tied up, which would make the suddenness of his death in a place he could not possibly escape from make sense. Now, where did his parents come in? Were they potentially aware of more than they were letting on before their deaths? Had they become liabilities to whoever Ejiro was spying for? Who was Ejiro working for, specifically? There were many possible destinations at the end of this rabbit hole that all had their own potential offshoot tunnels, so cracking this case was going to be a challenge. It was a good thing that Nezu always loved a challenge. The entire press room waited with bated breath for the impending arrival of the nation's top hero. After the bombshell that was Endeavor's press conference, the idea of All Might having something to say in an address to the public made a lot of people understandably nervous. It was completely unfathomable that the symbol of peace would have skeletons in his closet. He was the embodiment of justice and virtue. He'd have absolutely nothing to hide from the public, right? Then again, it was also unfathomable that Endeavor would have been an abusive husband and father as well as a eugenicist. That took the nation completely by surprise, as not even the most jaded of villains could have anticipated that he'd come out and say that. So, it was completely reasonable for every member of the press in the room to be trepidatious about what was to come, and that was the scene that Japan's top hero arrived at. Well, it would be more accurate to say that he crashed through the ceiling of the room heroically, of course, and struck a pose with his beaming smile for all present. "I am here," All Might triumphantly announced, jolting the assembled press out of their shock from his bombastic entrance. The room immediately set their undivided attention on the no. One hero clad in a yellow, pinstripe suit as he stepped up to the podium, happily ignoring the massive hole he left in the ceiling. "To announce my retirement," All Might finished, his smile still firmly in place amidst the looks of re-emerging shock from the assembled press. "Excuse me," one reporter found her voice enough to speak up. "What do you mean announce your retirement?" The most astute of reporters present noticed All Might's smile somewhat dim. For the last several decades, I have defended the nation from all evil that lurks in the darkness with my life. I have toppled criminal organizations, leaped into action during disasters, and done my very best to ensure the health and safety of all who call this beautiful nation home. I have acted as our society's symbol of peace, and nothing has ever given me greater joy." The man sighed, and the room full of reporters were hanging on his every word. "However, even I must acknowledge that there is one foe that I cannot defeat, no matter how long and how valiantly I do battle with him: Father Time. Many of you have probably noticed that I have been much less visible in recent years. My time spent on patrol and actively defending the safety of the public has been slowly diminishing as the years go on, but I stubbornly tried to persevere and continue doing my duty." His ever-present smile continued to dim further and further until it was a ghost of the familiar, comfort-bringing grin that they were all accustomed to. Despite the sea of concerns, questions, and remarks flooding their minds, not one person dared interrupt him. "It was finally during the battle in Camino that it all caught up with me," All Might solemnly continued. "I pulled every ounce of strength from within me to end that horrible monster's reign of terror for good. It may have appeared that my close comrades, Gran Torino and Verdant, and I had the situation safely under our control, and that was largely true. However, in that battle, I could feel it. I was running purely on the willpower necessary to protect you all with my dying breath and not on any particular strength of body." All Might somehow stared the entirety of the room in the eye, meeting each individual person's gaze to speak to them directly. "My worst fears have come to pass. I can no longer adequately defend the people of Japan to my own standards. My body will just not allow it anymore." Amidst the boxes littered around the soon-to-be former Midoriya household was Izuku, Inko, and Eri planted on the couch in front of the TV. Izuku's eyes were bulging out of his skull, and his jaw had taken up residence on the floor beside his feet. Inko was similarly thunderstruck. Of all things that All Might could have decided to announce after defeating his nemesis, officially riding off into the sunset was not anywhere on the list. Eri, meanwhile, looked between the two in mild confusion. She didn't quite understand what was going on that had them so shaken, but she couldn't fight the giggle fit that escaped her at Izuku's cartoonish reaction. Mitsuki Bakugo was worried. She figured something big was going to come from All Might making an announcement so soon after Endeavor's own reveal, and news of an apparent retirement certainly fit the bill of being big news. That wasn't what had her worried, though. Her son was dead silent. Not a peep, growl, or even the most minute of crackling from his palms could be heard. He just stared at the screen wearing the most vacant expression she had seen on him since she gave him a heavily redacted recount of why Inko retired from heroics. She understood why. All Might had been such a fundamental piece of his raison d'etre. Watching him admit to the slightest bit of humanity was jarring even for her, so she could only imagine what was storming through the mind of her son. She knew that he would be okay after it was all said and done, but she sincerely hoped that the path to get there wasn't too tumultuous. Once the reporters were able to collect themselves, the room flew into a frenzy. Questions were shouted left and right, all furiously trying to figure out what the nations know. One hero for the last several decades could possibly mean by saying that he couldn't defend them any longer. "All Might, you're not seriously retiring, are you?" one reporter managed to call out over the ruckus. "You aren't just the symbol of peace, you are our peace." For the first time since he arrived, All Might visibly frowned, silencing the room once more. It wasn't an angry frown or one of consternation. Rather, it was a thoughtful frown that was born of the man having wrestled with that very sentiment and its present and future consequences. Perhaps retirement was too strong of a word, All Might mused, considering the question. If a great evil threatens the safety of Japan, her people, and her peace, then I will step in and defend our society in the only way I know how. He could see many faces in the sea of press that were eased by the statement at least somewhat, but many were still unsettled, so he continued. I promise that you all have absolutely nothing to fear. I am not leaving society behind empty-handed by any means. Over the past few months, I have become intimately aware of the fantastic capabilities of the current generation and boundless potential of the future generation of heroes. Believe me when I say that young heroes will rise and take this world by storm in only a matter of time, and they will protect and defend society far better than I ever possibly could. More and more reporters were cowed by his assurances, though many were expectedly skeptical. One woman stood out to him, however, a woman with blue skin and lilac hair with an almost unnerving smile on her face had been rather composed for the duration of the press conference. She looked familiar to him, but he couldn't place where he had seen her before. The woman in question ended up speaking up amidst the low muttering and garnering All Might's direct attention. By future generation, are you referring to Izuku Midoriya, perhaps? You mentioned at the UA Sports Festival that he would be a fantastic symbol one day, even if he doesn't explicitly want to succeed you. Even still, are you grooming him to take up the mantle of society's protector? No, was All Might's succinct response, and that caught most of the room off guard. It only made sense that a powerful hero to be that received glowing endorsements from both the symbol of peace and the hero killer would be forced into being All Might's protege if for no other reason than to prevent him from falling down the latter path regardless of his specific desires for his hero career. Young Midoriya is a bright, young hero with an even brighter future, All Might continued, recapturing the rapt attention of the room. I have nothing but the purest of faith that he will be a beacon all his own and guide society into a bright future with or without my guidance. He is an unstoppable force for justice and a bringer of hope for all in society, regardless of your status, background, or history. Oh my God, he's making me sound like a cult leader, Izuku frantically whined while Eri continued giggling at him, occasionally patting him on the back to help assuage his dismay. Considering what you can inspire people to do, you're already well on your way, Inko spoke up, having joined Eri in reveling in her son's comical downward spiral. Before you know it, you'll have the entire nation wearing replicas of that lovely scarf Ochako got you. It is a fabulous scarf, Izuku lowly conceded with a sigh. He took a few more moments of sulking at the added attention this would inevitably bring him until he felt a small hand tug at his sleeve. When he looked over, he saw Eri looking up at him with big eyes brimming with curiosity. "Who's Ochako?" she asked him, and he couldn't help but smile. "You'll meet her when we move into UA tomorrow," he answered and lightly ruffled her hair, eliciting even further giggling from her. He adored how quickly she was breaking out of the shell that she was locked in when they found her. She clearly trusted them, and it warmed his newly enlarged and dense heart to see her be able to relax, ask questions, and just be a child. On the flip side, he was also worried about how quickly she was breaking out of her shell because she was anything but a cinnamon roll when left to her own devices. She was a sponge that absorbed and processed information much too quickly for any child her age, and like any child, she was always observing. She watched his routine, how he organized things, how long it took him to walk to the bathroom from the kitchen and back, where he stashed his snacks, the first places he'd look if something was missing, and all the places he wouldn't look, etc. There was a missing box of Rakugan that he'd been pulling his hair out over for the last few days. She knew that he knew that she knew where it was, but she also knew that he wouldn't ask because his pride would not allow him to be outwitted by a 6-year-old. He'd find that damn thing if it was the last thing he did, and then he wouldn't share any of it with her. He totally would. Tamura yawned as he trudged down the hallway towards the living room of the apartment that they borrowed from its newly deceased owner. It wasn't anything special, nor was it particularly big like their previous hideout before it was burned to ashes by Dabai, but it would have to do for the time being. On the plus side, the place had cable and decent Wi-Fi, so operating there wouldn't be a total slog until Kurogiri and Jurin could find them better digs. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Tamura was nearly jolted awake at the unexpected shouting from the living room. He really wasn't in the mood to deal with a ruckus so early in the afternoon after a long night of gaming. When he turned the corner into the living room, he set his tires glare on his reptilian comrade sitting on the couch sporting a look of horror. Beside him on the couch was Twice filling out a crossword puzzle with help from, well, himself. Mr. Compress sat off to the side tinkering with his new prosthetic. He really needed to hunt that fuckhead Overhaul down and murder him for that. And Kurogiri stood in the adjoining kitchen, wiping already spotless glass cups that he almost certainly pulled out of the cupboard. "The hell are you screaming about, Spinner?" Tamura groaned after completing his observation of the scene. "All Might is retiring," Spinner shouted, pointing at the buffoon in the stupid, yellow suit on screen. It took Tamura a few moments to fully process what had just been screamed at him, but when he did, his eyes went wide. "Say fucking what?" Tamura disbelievingly questioned. "It's true," Mr. Compress spoke up. According to him, his body has been in decline for the last few years, and his showdown with your former benefactor at Camino was the last straw. He insists that he just cannot go any longer. "Bullshit," Tamura responded. He didn't seem any different from the Asjet Camino. He was leveling the terrain with Sen with All for One just fine. "Do you believe that there is something more to his sudden retirement?" Kurogiri posed from the kitchen counter, ignoring the brief slip of the tongue from Tamura. "There has to be," Tamura nodded before turning back to Mr. Compress. "What else did he say?" "Well, he did mention his desire to let the current and future generations take up the mantle of societal pillars in his stead," Mr. Compress mused with a stroke of the base of his mask. Tamura sat on that bit of information for a long minute. While Spinner was coming down from his crisis and Twice was continuing on with his puzzle, Tamura mulled over the thought of All Might throwing in the towel and leaving it to the future generations. Frankly, it sounded absurd. There was no reason for All Might to take a step back, even with All for One's death. He was still the most powerful person in this hemisphere, and that had been the case for the past 5 years when he was supposed to have been gravely injured by All for One. He'd only take a step back if he absolutely had to, and nothing would keep him on the sidelines barring losing his quirk. "That son of a bitch," Tamura muttered, believing he had potentially come to the correct conclusion. "What is it, Tamura?" Kurogiri inquired, placing the glass down and giving the man his full attention. "He passed on his quirk," Tamura assuredly stated. "He passed on one for all." Now, he had the attention of everyone in the room. Even Twice had stopped scribbling in his crossword to face Tamura, though he refused to look him in the eye after being the impetus for the overhaul fiasco that resulted in Magni's death. "All Might has a successor?" Spinner asked, his tone filled with an unstable blend of curiosity, excitement, confusion, and dread. "More than likely," Tamura confirmed. "Do you think it's Midoriya?" Mr. Compress posed the idea. Tamura shook his head. "Wouldn't be him. Unless All Might forced it into him, I strongly doubt that he would accept it in the first place. I got a pretty good read on him from our few conversations. It's not him." "So, if not him, then who else could possibly be worthy of succeeding All Might?" Spinner racked his brain. The only other possible candidate in his opinion would be the other half of the worthy duo, Endeavor's son. "No fucking idea," Tamura shrugged. "Guess we'll have to find out for ourselves." "And how do we do that?" Spinner asked, almost frantically. Tamura noticed that Spinner had seemed particularly on edge, even beyond hearing the news of All Might's retirement. Before he could address it, though, Spinner stood up and spoke again. "And while we're at it, what are we even doing? What's our goal, Tamura?" "Where the hell is all this coming from?" Tamura asked with a bit of irritation. "At Camino, you killed All for One," Spinner began, his tone growing steady and clearer. "I stood behind you because I follow and believe in you and your dreams, not the dreams of some ancient madman. But if there was one thing that we had with All for One, it was focus. We were focused. We had clear goals, clear ambitions, and a clear path to achieve them. We don't have that anymore. Things feel so aimless now. Spinner took a breath and gathered his thoughts, and the rest of the room remained silent as he did so. We've been losing people left and right. We lost people at the camp raid, we lost Toga at Camino, Dabai blew his top, and no one has seen him since. We just lost Magni to those Yakuza bastards, and Kusari is off doing who knows what in who knows where. Kusari said that he had something important to take care of, and that he'd have to lay low for a while, Twice supplied. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. He seems like a pretty upfront guy. My point is that we feel lost right now, Spinner continued. It's like we're just waiting for something to happen. What is it that you want to accomplish, Tamura? The pale-haired young adult silently considered everything Spinner had said to him. The idea of what he himself wanted to accomplish threw him right back to the initial meeting with Stain, where he was confronted with figuring out who he was and what he wanted to represent. He had spent so long under all for one's thumb, internalizing all for one's ambitions, and now that he had freed himself, he found that he couldn't differentiate what he desired and what all for one wanted him to desire. He knew that society was broken and needed to be fixed, but he didn't know if the hatred and bitterness that festered into desire for wanton destruction was entirely his own. I want, Tamura trailed off, tasting the words on his own tongue as if trying out the idea of personal agency for the first actual time. I want change. The other men stared at Tamura quizzically and with mild incredulity. Is that it? Spinner asked. Change? Our society is broken, Tamura continued, and he motioned to everyone in the room. We all exist because society is fundamentally broken in so many ways. Compress, you want to expose corruption in the government and hero society. Spinner, you want to purge the world of all the false heroes that help to maintain the status quo that abuses people like you. Twice, you want to be able to exist without judgment among those who will see you as an actual person, since hero society was never there for you, especially when you needed it. He took a long look around the room, meeting everyone's eyes with his increasingly focused gaze. Society has made each of us and so many others into the irredeemable monsters we are. With that said, burning it down and building a new one won't automatically fix those issues. It'll just kick the can down the road or create newer issues to take their places. So, what do we do about them, then? Spinner spoke up once more. What's left to do if not a revolution? A manic grin found purchase on Tamura's face. We may not be able to go the route of revolution just yet, but we can go the route of brutal reform. We expose the corruption in the government and in heroics. We hold heroes accountable for the damage they often carelessly do. We take people and their bigoted, prejudiced ideas to task head-on. We eliminate the bad actors that make our society what it is, and then we reinforce the remaining structure into the society we all deserve, one we can all feel free to simply exist in without any worries. The others in the room were struck silent. None of them had ever really known Tamura to be capable of this level of insight, nor did they expect him to be able to formulate and articulate his new mission statement on the fly and do so clearly. We don't have to burn society down wholesale in order to break down the parts that caused all of our suffering, Tamura continued on, his grin becoming menacing as his thoughts fell into place like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. We just have to expose and destroy what taints it. Then we'll be on the path to utopia. Then we seize the means of production and... Tamura, Kurogiri halted the young man with a wispy hand. That is beyond the scope. No, you're right, Tamura conceded after taking a deep breath. I got a little carried away. We start small, then we work our way up. Hold on, so we're fighting corruption, quirkism, and the falsehoods of heroics? Mr. Compress asked for clarification. Among other things, but yeah, pretty much, Tamura confirmed. I have to say, that's quite a pivot from the criminal enterprise I initially thought we'd work towards, Mr. Compress noted with a thoughtful tone. I do find the new direction fascinating. I'm in, too, Spinner excitedly declared. We'd be like chaotic neutral mercenaries. That sounds badass. Tamara nodded, and he looked to the third, awfully silent man. Twice pensively clutched his hands, still unable to meet Tamira's gaze. I'm in, if you'll have me. No way. Why wouldn't we? Tamira asked with a raised eyebrow. Because I'm a screw-up, he finally let out. I'm the one who brought Overhaul into the fold to begin with. If it weren't for me, Big Sis Mag would still be here, and Compress would still have his arm. How can I be good for anything if all I do is put the people I care about in danger? Tamira stared blankly at the raving man. He didn't know the first fucking thing about consoling people. His default thought was to dust him and go back to bed. But that wouldn't be terribly productive. He needed to think. How the hell was he going to get Twice's head on straight when he knew fuck all about emotional intelligence? Looking to Kirigiri, the man's glowing, yellow eyes momentarily met his before darting away, and he internally cursed. Obviously, Kirigiri wasn't going to be any fucking help, so he had to try a different tact. Who or what could he possibly draw from in this situation? Then it finally hit him, his cousin. He'd definitely know what to do in this situation, the thoughtful little shit. So, the one question he needed to answer was, what would Midoriya do? Back at the Midoriya household, Izuku sneezed while packing away his analysis notebooks, spraying the top of the stack with a small quantity of spittle. Got him it, Izuku grumbled, forgetting that Eri was drawing in the corner of his room but still keeping her ears open. It appeared that she learned a new word. It's not your fault, Tamira finally said, earning Twice's attention. What do you mean? Twice asked in confusion. How wasn't it his fault? It could have been any of us in that position. It just happened to be you. That asshole was going to try to kill us anyway, and it sucks that we lost Magni, but she'd want us to get the fuck back up and keep going. We won't let her death be in vain. We'll fix this fucked up society together. He stepped toward Twice and put his hand out, tucking his pinky on instinct to avoid disintegrating him. So, are you in? Twice stared at the offered hand, and then he finally brought his eyes up to meet Tamura's before nodding and enthusiastically shaking the hand. I'm in. Bitchin', Tamura grinned. We need a new name, then, Spinner excitedly declared. How about the League of Anti-Villains? We'll workshop it. The day to return to Yue was upon them before everyone knew it. Wana was standing outside of their new living situation for the foreseeable future in awe and excitement. As their homeroom teacher briefed them on their new digs, responsibilities, and expectations, they were all just glad to have been past their harrowing ordeal safe, sound, and all together. Well, mostly together. Mr. Aizawa? Mina raised her hand after the man had finished his spiel. Where are Ajiro and Aoyama? Did they not get permission to move in with the rest of us? The man sighed, dreading this question but expecting it nonetheless. I'll explain later tonight after you are all settled in. For right now, though. His voice developed a darker edge, placing everyone on their guard. Gyro, Hagakure, Mainta, and Midoriya, you four are dismissed. The rest of you stay behind. The four confusedly looked around and amongst each other, while the rest of the class save for a few went pale at the realization of what was happening. Izuku quickly picked up on what their teacher was planning, and he shot the other three named students quick but meaningful glances. No, I don't think I will, Izuku said to his teacher, taking both him and the others aback. I have a feeling I know exactly what this is about, so I think I'm gonna stick around. The blunt declaration from their class rep emboldened the others to follow suit. Mainta scooted closer to Izuku's left side in solidarity, while Toru did the same on his right, and Gyro got even closer to the rest of her class to drive the point home. Aizawa sighed and rubbed his eyes with his thumb and index finger before activating his quirk and glaring at the 18 students. Give me one good reason I shouldn't expel the 14 of you right now, he asked in a dark, angry tone. He was met with a very loud silence from his class. They all knew that this was coming. Aizawa wasn't just going to not address his entire class illegally storming a battlefield to rescue a captured classmate. Regardless of their intentions or the results, what they did was blatant vigilantism, and they all knew and accepted that. It did nothing to make their teacher's glare any less imposing, though. No one was speaking up, and Izuku could feel the nervous tension taking root amongst them. He was preparing to open his mouth and address his teacher, but, surprisingly, Tsu beat him to it. She decided to take the heat and answer the question in the only way Tsu knew how. Because you went to the trouble of going to all of our homes and asking our parents for permission for us to move in. Unfettered bluntness with a sarcastic tinge, an art that Tsu had more than perfected. Her face was as dry and non-emotive as it typically was, though Aizawa could tell that she was actively trying to keep her face as blank as possible. Still, Aizawa was silent at the answer, and that silence carried on for another half-minute. The class of nervously sweating students were left to either wilt or do their best to weather their teacher's heated, glowing glare for the duration of the silence. "Give me 2 good reasons," Aizawa finally spoke, and the tension suffocating the class was smashed with a sledgehammer. "We just did what any hero would do." Kirishima opted to speak up now that most of them were much more at ease thanks to Tsu. "And that's the problem. You aren't heroes yet," Aizawa reprimanded. "You all are still unlicensed students. You could have gotten yourselves killed. You could have gotten Midoriya killed. You could have gotten any of the pros on scene or any civilians in the vicinity killed. Did any of you think about any of that before you embarked on your idiotic expedition?" If any of the students were going to reply, Aizawa didn't give them the chance. "You all aren't heroes, not yet, anyway. You're prohibited from publicly using your quirks and doing hero work without at least a license, which is what you all are working towards in the first place. Try not to mess that up before you even take the test, got it?" "Yes, sir," Wana dutifully replied, mostly out of habit. "Good," he sighed and turned to leave. "Go in and unpack, then get settled. We get back to work tomorrow morning." Melissa absent-mindedly went through the motions of unpacking her things. To say her mind was elsewhere would be an understatement. Her mind was far beyond the reaches of the Kuiper belt at this point. It was the occasional stinging pain shooting up her bandaged hands that brought her back from the cosmos to her completely topsy-turvy reality, and they acted as an ever-present reminder of possibly the biggest change in her life thus far. Reaching for one of the remaining boxes and opening it up, she froze when she was met with the sight of her smashed picture frame that was sloppily pieced back together with duct tape and superglue. Within the patchwork frame was a photo of herself and her dad. It was the one she brought with her from her lab. She stared blankly at the picture as it stared back at her. Her father's smiling face bore a hole through her gut and pumped her with lead, slowly dragging her down to her knees as she warred with herself to choke the bubbling emotions back down. The more she stared at the photo and the more her father's smile laughed right in her face, the harder it was to maintain her composure. Her bandaged hands were clamping down on either side of the box like a vice, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of power coursing through her. She was shaking. She needed to calm down. She needed to calm down. She needed to calm down. In an instant, the power surged and exploded out of her, causing her to crush the edges of the box in her hand as a brief flicker of staticky, black tendrils manifested around her. The mini-explosion sent her unfinished room into disarray, knocking down the few things she had put up and even pushing some of the furniture askew. Just as quickly as it began, though, it was over, and she was left heaving on the floor as the pain started to seep back in. "God damn it," she gritted out, and the tears were not far behind. "You're such an idiot." She couldn't fight the sobs any longer, and she broke down. The well of turmoil churning within her gut was finally spilling out, and she didn't even attempt to choke back her sobbing. She simply grabbed the shoddily repaired frame and hugged it tightly to her bosom. "I miss you, Papa." As her tears began to run dry, she felt like she had aged a few decades in only a few minutes. Sitting up against the side of her bed, She sighed and silently lamented what her life had become at the hands of that fucking red-headed bastard. She cut her train of thought off right there, refusing to allow herself to grant him any further power over her than he had already. She wouldn't allow that. She couldn't allow that. She would persevere. You aren't alone, Ninth. Her head snapped up at the soft, almost ghostly feminine voice traveling through her ears. She looked around her room, but no one was in the room with her. Is someone there? She called out, wondering if someone might have heard the noise or her crying and called out from behind the door. However, no response came. That was odd. She wanted to chalk it up to a stress-induced auditory hallucination and move on. But it wasn't the only strange occurrence to come about in recent weeks. She had been having strange dreams, usually involving herself floating in a dark, wispy void, and she could just barely make out several glowing silhouettes in the distance, but she could never make it far enough to properly investigate them. Maybe it was all related to receiving Uncle Mite's quirk. She'd have to find him and ask him about it first thing in the morning. Until then, though, she really needed to clean up and finish unpacking. Eri clutched Izuku's hand tightly as the two made their way down the stairs. After her big brother that was still so weird to think about had unpacked all of his things, he and her new mom that was even stranger helped her settle into her very own room. It was the first time she had ever had something like it that wasn't just a cold, beige chamber for her to sit and wait for overhaul to come in and snatch her away. At the apartment, she slept in Izuku's room because she didn't want to be alone, and he could soothe her with his warm, orange blankets when her curse started to act up. Oh, that was another thing. Her big brother didn't like it when she called her power a curse. He didn't believe that it was a curse at all, and he said that all abilities had their advantages and disadvantages. She thinks she got that word right. She wasn't so sure, but he said that he'd help her train her power to be able to control it and never have to worry about it again, and that made her really happy. After all of that, though, Izuku wanted to introduce her to his class. She wasn't so certain about meeting so many new people at once, but he was really excited about it, so she nervously went along with the idea. Clutching onto his hand and leaning into his leg, they descended the final flight of stairs and slowly approached the entrance to the common area. You ready, Eri? Izuku asked with a kind smile. She did her best to put on a brave face and nodded, and Izuku gently ruffled her hair, putting her slightly at ease. Following behind him as he entered the open room, she tried not to fade into invisibility behind Izuku's legs once his friends noticed him and their eyes inevitably landed on her. Oh my god, who is this adorable little thing? Toru gushed over the small girl as she quickly approached. However, a gentle sign from Izuku indicated to her that Eri was still wary around people and to not crowd her. This is Eri, Izuku introduced, gently nudging her to poke her head around his legs. She adopted us, so she'll be living up here, too. Don't you mean that you adopted her? Kaminari confusedly questioned his choice of words. Nope, Izuku said with a smile and did not elaborate further. Eri, of course, soon became the center of attention, but everyone had the wherewithal to give her a comfortable amount of space. She liked most of them, though she was really wary of Takoyami given his bird head was too reminiscent of Overhaul and his men. However, it was surprisingly Dark Shadow that was able to smooth things over and endear the two of them to the girl. She honestly didn't know how she ended up separated from the group and watching anime with the pink girl, Mina, on the couch. She was really bubbly, though, and she said that they were horn buddies now, which sounded cool, so she'd stick around with Mina whenever possible. There was one thing that stuck out to her about the teenage girl, though. Her appearance was odd, even for their world's standards. It wasn't like Eri had seen a lot of people in her life, but she did at least know that many were strange-looking by nature. Still, there was something so different about Mina that Eri couldn't quite place. So, after a few minutes of curiously and blatantly staring at her, while Mina did her best to ignore it without bursting into a laughing fit, Eri finally voiced her question. Are you an alien? Mina's eyes briefly widened, and her head snapped down to look at the little girl. Then, she looked around to see if anyone was paying attention. "Can you keep a secret?" When Eri excitedly nodded, Mina took one last look around to ensure they wouldn't be heard before giving Eri a serious look. "I'm not from this part of the galaxy. I'm a refugee that escaped from an evil space emperor that conquered and sold my home planet into slavery. And I came to Earth because it's one of the few places that isn't on the Empire's radar." Eri looked on in shock and awe. She was in the presence of an actual alien, but what's more was that she was in trouble and hiding from a mean space emperor, Imperial Emporium. She was hiding from a space jerk. "I'll protect you," Eri declared, and she meant it. She'd protect her from the space jerk like her new mom protected her from Overhaul, and her big brother was protecting her from her curse and the jerks in suits that they talked about when they thought she wasn't listening. One day, they would learn that she was always listening. Just then, Izuku floated above the two on couch with Ochako, who was also floating, throttling him as Ida tried desperately to calm the girl down. "How could you not tell me that you added this little munchkin to the family? That is a huge development," Ochako scolded while clamping down on his neck and shaking him. If it weren't for the fact that she could barely make a dent in his ridiculously sturdy exterior, he might have actually been concerned for his health. "It never came up," Izuku struggled to answer. He'd been having this same conversation a lot lately given his mother's newfound celebrity status. "Never came up?" Ochako fumed before pausing and taking a deep breath. "How did you come across her?" It was Eri who spoke up this time, knowing exactly how to answer that question. "The scary bird man tried to kidnap me from my mommy and big brother." A beat of confusion rested amongst the present students, and Izuku sighed. "Eri, that cover story doesn't work with people who already know that we aren't actually related." Eri huffed and pouted upon realizing that she used her story incorrectly. "Goddammit." Most of the surrounding students who heard that fell into aghast laughter, with the exception of Ida, who was just aghast. "Midoriya, are you teaching this little girl foul language?" Ida reprimanded. "Yes, Izuku, are you?" An older, feminine voice addressed from the elevator, making the greenhead's blood run cold. Izuku turned his attention to the elevator to see his mother with her eyes narrowed at him beside a positively exhausted-looking Aizawa. "Hi, Mom," Izuku warily greeted, turning his head to look in her direction while Ochako let go of him to do the same. "Hi, Sensei," Ochako happily greeted with a wave. "Your son's being a doofus." "He makes a habit of it," Inko sighed with an understanding nod, smirking at the affronted squawk from her son. "Come on, Eri, let's get something to eat." Immediately popping up at the promise of food, the little one waved goodbye to everyone before bounding over to Inko and following her back into the elevator. Beside the elevator, Aizawa sighed his life away, not looking forward to the discussion he was about to have with his class. He corralled the 18 students into a single area to break the news. "Earlier today, you asked where Ojiro and Aoyama were," he began, and everyone grew a bit apprehensive at the forlorn disposition he sported. He idly noticed both Shoji and Maita in particular stiffen at the mention of Ojiro. "Well, one of those is easier to answer than the other," Aizawa continued. "Ojiro was revealed at training camp to be a spy for the villains." "What?" the class shouted in disbelief, which Aizawa expected. He activated his quirk and glared at them before they could get going, silencing them so that he could continue. "It was difficult to wrap my head around, too. That is until we caught him in the act shortly after the attack, and he was arrested." Wano was stunned silent. Reactions ranged from disbelief to overt dismay to crackling rage, and all were marinating in a budding inkling of distrust amongst the class. If one of them was a spy all along and fed the villains who knows how many secrets about them, who's to say that no one else in the class was a spy, too? Aizawa had to nip this in the bud right now. "Do not let this tear you all apart after everything you've endured together," Aizawa commanded in a tone that smashed through any sparking unease amongst them. With everything going on in the country and in your direct future, this is not the time for infighting. All Might said in his speech that he had faith in the future generations to take up his mantle in his absence, and that means you all. It's time for you all to step up and become the true heroes you're training to be. Seeing that he was reaching them, he went ahead with a final assurance. Ojiro was and is still the only one to our knowledge, and we can thank Mainta for exposing him. And Aoyama? Izuku questioned. Aizawa sighed. That's difficult. We currently don't know where he is. Wait, he's missing? Kirishima sputtered. Yes, the man solemnly confirmed. He and his family were attacked in their home sometime during or shortly after the Kamino incident, and we haven't been able to find any trace of him since. A dreary atmosphere settled in amongst the class. One of their classmates and friends was a spy, and the other had gone missing after an attack. There was so much to process in such a minuscule amount of time, and they were still expected to persevere and carry on like normal. How possible was that going to be? Aizawa broke them from their thoughts with his final words. The search will continue, and we will find him. Until then, you will all work your asses off to become the best heroes you can in his honor. Then, if necessary, you can all join the search effort to finally recover him. Understood? Yes, sir, the class answered with a growing resolve. Good. You're dismissed. Try not to burn the dorm down, or you're expelled. Madam President of the Hero Public Safety Commission's frigid gaze was locked onto the screen in front of her that was broadcasting another replay of All Might's shocking press conference. So soon after Endeavor shocked the nation with his exposé, All Might stunned the world by announcing his semi-retirement from heroics in lieu of allowing the next generation to build themselves up. She should have been rattled by this development given its thunderous ramifications, but she wasn't. In fact, she was pleased. All Might himself was difficult to control. His absurd power made it all but impossible to threaten him, and his lack of familial ties afforded them no one to leverage over him. It was only his nature of being heroic to a fault that prevented him from becoming their most dangerous adversary. At the very least, he reasoned with in his pursuit of ensuring the safety of the public. After all, compromise was often necessary. However, the retirement of the symbol of peace was a blessing in disguise, as it was one crucial roadblock out of the way of steamrolling Nezu. Though All Might's loyalties to Yue and Nezu weren't inherent, there was enough smoke for there to be fire, and she would see that any fires be swiftly put out. With one of Nezu's potentially most powerful and influential pieces no longer on the board, their game was substantially more winnable. It was all about the bigger picture. Should we move ahead with the Paragon Initiative, Madam President? One of her aides to her side spoke up as she ended the transmission. No, that is not yet necessary, she denied with a shake of her head, closing her eyes. We can position Hawks to be the number one for the foreseeable future without having to resort to extreme measures. We will revisit the subject should things grow to be too complicated in the future. She reopened her eyes, and her steely gray gaze froze the others in the room with her in place despite not being focused on them whatsoever. Until that time, we keep our focus on Yua, Nezu, and Izuku Midoriya. By the end of things, they will all either have fallen in line or have simply fallen. Izuku opened his eyes to find himself treading through a sea of blue flames sprawling through the dark expanse that was the void. Curious as to why he was back there, he meandered through the sapphire blaze, the chilly flames kissing his skin as he trudged through to find the death god. It did not take very long for the entity in question to appear before him, their two tails lazily swaying behind them as they laid down, bathed in the fiery, blue abyss. I wasn't expecting to be brought back here so soon after our last meeting, Izuku remarked. I sensed that you had concerns about your situation regarding the soul fragments inhabiting your vessel, Matatabi responded as the vestiges of Quirk's all-for-one stole appeared around them. Fair enough, Izuku nodded, no longer questioning how the death god could hear his thoughts even when he wasn't aware he was having them. I want to return these quirks to their rightful owners like I did with Ragdoll. How can I go about doing that? You may do so in the same manner that you returned Shirotoko's soul fragment to her, Matatabi answered matter-of-factly. Bathe them in my fire, and the soul will reconnect on its own volition. Right, I figured as much, but how will I be able to find them to do that? You already have the solution to that. You just do not yet realize it. Izuku's brow furrowed at that. I'm not following you. A sly grin took shape on the face of the cat deity. You have unintentionally brandished that aspect of our connection in the past when you used a small portion of it for intimidation purposes. Izuku mulled that over for a few seconds before it finally dawned on him. Wait, so when I channel your flames and my eyes take on the appearance of yours while the feeling of death permeates all around, I'm unlocking another aspect of that part of the quirk. Precisely. You just have to focus the power a bit more directly, and you will achieve what you desire. That, wow, Izuku remarked in stupefaction. I didn't know your abilities were so varied, at least in regard to me. My powers are not narrow by any means. You just do not know how to properly wield them without killing yourself. Fair, I suppose, Izuku conceded with a huff. Is this still part of you throwing me a bone for one's soul and all the quirks he stole? You helping me out on your own volition makes me wildly uncomfortable because I have no idea what you'll eventually ask for in return. That is exactly why I do it, Matatabi answered with their signature Cheshire grin. Just as well, of all the humans I have had a connection with in one fashion or another, you have been the most interesting to observe. You brought me a runaway and a false prophet in no time at all. Killing you now would be such a waste. I want to witness exactly what you become when allowed to reach your full potential. Izuku was floored. That was legitimately high praise coming from the mouth of a literal deity. Then, once I have had my fun and have grown bored of you, I will kill you, the Shinigami finished with its malicious grin. And there it was. Izuku shouldn't have been surprised. Indeed, you should not have been, Matatabi agreed. Anyway, Izuku muttered, rubbing one of his temples before looking around at the vestiges surrounding them. If I channel the blue flames through my senses again, I should be able to pinpoint exactly who these quirks belong to and where they are, right? More or less, the massive cat god replied. You may not get an exact identity of the person, as you are not me, but you will be able to feel their location. Awesome, Izuku nodded. Is that all you needed of me? Matatabi simply nodded and did not say anything more. The two stared at each other for another lengthy, awkward moment of silence until Izuku realized that Matatabi was letting the silence drag again for their own amusement, and he quickly exited the realm. Snapping out of his sleep mere moments before the blaring of his alarm clock began, Izuku shut it off with a violet tendril and stretched. He gazed down at the violet flame still protruding from his index finger, and he got an idea. Might as well give it a go to see what happens, Izuku muttered, and blue flames replaced the violet, quickly engulfing him. Focusing as hard as he could, Izuku corralled the soul fragments within his quirk and extended the Shinigami's senses as far as he could push them. He had no idea what the upper limit was, so he just kept spreading his reach. Unexpectedly, something bit, and Izuku's newly yellow and green cat eyes snapped open. He felt something from within the distance tugging at one of the fragments like a fish biting down on a lure. He didn't want to extend that analogy any further by attempting to reel them in, as he had no idea what sort of horrific fate it could potentially spell for the person. Thinking back to how interacting with Ragdoll's soul felt, he'd rather not violently rip someone's soul out of them if he could help it. He killed the flames, reverting his eyes to their usual human variety, and a deep sigh escaped him. While he was attempting to extend the reach of the Shinigami as far as he could, Yuo was a massive campus, and he was certain that he hadn't moved past the bounds of the school. The magnitude of what he had just felt was quickly dawning on him. There's a quirkless student at UA, Izuku muttered, and all for one nabbed their quirk from them. Likely when they were really young. Fuck, man. At the same time that Izuku was entering the realm of the Shinigami, Melissa found herself standing in a void of her own. Well, standing may not have been the correct word, as she didn't have any feet. In fact, most of her body was engulfed in black fog, and only the top half of her head was visible. She wanted to write this off as a very peculiar dream, but she didn't really feel like she was dreaming. Even without a corporeal form, the sensations she was feeling were much too real to merely be her imagination at work. Frantically darting her eyes around, she saw that the rest of the void she was floating in was just as dark and just as foggy, save for one particular area just ahead. Squinting, she could just barely make out several bright flames. At least she thought they were flames of all colors in the distance. Her curiosity got the better of her, so she instinctively started floating towards where the activity seemed to be. If she was going to get any answers about where she was or what was even happening, this was the best place to start. As she approached, she began to make out several voices firing off at each other. The heated nature of the speech told her that she wasn't stumbling into a friendly dispute. Bestowing this power to a weak, untrained, and emotional child? This is ludicrous, Melissa heard a man heatedly spit. She's no more emotional than anyone would be in her situation, Melissa then heard a woman fire back. She lost her father for fuck's sake. He's not dead, he's just an idiot, the first voice replied, and Melissa wasn't sure how much she liked this one. We've all watched this girl grow through the eyes of Eighth. She's a scientist, not a combatant. She can't even properly wield the power within One for All without mangling herself. Then we'll train her, damn it, the woman remained firm. None of us were ready for the power of One for All when we first received it. But we all worked ourselves ragged until we were. We can do the same for Ninth. Putting together what the argument was about wasn't a difficult task. Melissa was glad that at least one of the previous holders of One for All was staunchly in her corner. You don't get it, he growled. We all had a reason to get stronger. We didn't have a choice. But All for One is dead now. Passing on this much power to someone who can't even manage 1% of it is the height of irresponsibility, and you're only defending this ridiculous move because it was your dumbass successor that did it. Watch your fucking tone, Scarface, she replied dangerously. What did I do? Another man spoke up now, drawing Melissa's attention to another glowing figure. She was close enough now to make sense of the humanoid flames that weren't really flames at all. The two arguing parties were a man with spiky, salmon hair and a large scar running diagonally across the bridge of his nose, and a muscular woman with black hair whose face looked incredibly familiar to her. Not you, Scarface, she yelled at the owner of the third voice before turning back to the man she was originally glaring daggers at. I'm talking to this tomato-headed dipshit. Sheesh, Nana's on a roll again, another voice spoke up. This one coming from a tall, bald man with goggles on his forehead who was standing beside a much shorter man with a high collar. How did you manage to deal with that before you croaked? Keep quiet and keep out of the way, he sighed before looking to Melissa, catching her off guard. This happens every so often. You just have to let them get it out of their system before we resume civil discussion. Would you like some tea? Melissa only offered the man a blank stare in response, and the man grew a bit anxious. You know, because you don't have a mouth, so it would be impossible to drink any tea. The silence dragged on as the argument continued in the background, and the man eventually sighed in defeat. No one ever laughs at my jokes. Being funny is a prerequisite for that, and the taller man chuckled. Somehow, Nana honed her comedic chops in spite of you. Melissa was officially at a loss for words irrespective of the fact that she had no mouth. This was at least an explanation for the chaotic energy she perpetually felt coursing through her veins. Guys, the tired voice of a thin man with white hair echoed through the void. She's here. The arguing ceased, and the two vestiges' attention snapped towards the cloud of black fog that was Melissa. Almost immediately afterward, The scarred man that was arguing before and another man with a high ponytail turned and walked towards the back wall where they would remain for the duration of the meeting. Meanwhile, 5 pairs of eyes were locked onto her, and her incorporeal form started to sweat. The woman, sensing the tension, decided to smash it by walking back to an area where 7 ornate chairs stood alongside a small folding chair holding a bright, golden flame in the shape of a man that strongly resembled Uncle Might. Hoisting the golden man up to his feet, she grabbed the folding chair and returned to where the other vestiges surrounded Melissa. Offering her a warm, genuine smile all the while, she placed the folding chair onto the ground with the seat facing away from Melissa, and she sat down with her arms folded and resting on the headrest. "So, you got a quirk." Going through his morning routine in the new environment was an adjustment for Izuku. In fact, it was an adjustment for everyone. It was strange to be literally living with their classmates, but after a very brief phase of awkwardness, one fell into comfortable camaraderie as if they had all grown up together. Bonding through trauma will often do that. Heights Alliance was only a 5-minute walk to U.S. main building, which was where Izuku, Shoto, Ochako, Tsu, and Ida found themselves as they strolled to class. The group was indulging in casual conversation primarily centered around their excitement for the new trimester after they completed the last of their summer training. Shoto, however, was silent, more silent than usual. That is, he'd cast tentative glances in Izuku's direction every 10 seconds or so, seeming as if he wanted to say something. He'd particularly focus on Ochako's beaming smile at Izuku wearing the scarf she got for him despite the sweltering heat. Shoto could empathize with that, also being fireproof. Izuku, meanwhile, had noticed his friend's odd behavior, but he let it go on for a few minutes to allow him to work up the courage himself to ask whatever was on his mind. When it became clear that it was not going to happen if he didn't intervene, he decided to spare his friend the difficulty. "You all right, Shoto?" Izuku asked him. Shoto's eyes minutely widened at being made, but that surprise quickly faded when he considered who he was talking to. "Midoriya, may I ask you something?" Shoto cast a glance toward the other 3 teens that were curiously observing them before facing Izuku again. "Privately?" Ochako took the hint and yanked Ida and Tsu by the arm. "Come on, guys, I don't want to be late for our first day of training." "Uraraka, I applaud the desire for punctuality, but please, be careful," Ida shouted as she sprinted towards the building with the other 2 literally in tow. After letting out a soft snort, Izuku turned back to his friend. "So, what's up?" Shoto hesitated for a moment before finding his resolve. "Do you ever feel strange around Uraraka?" That was not even in the ballpark of things Izuku was expecting his friend to ask him. For another solid 10 seconds, Izuku could only offer Shoto a blank, mute stare in response. Then, his brain finally regained function. What? Have you ever felt a strange combination of warmth, a boost of energy, and the inclination to be around her when she's in your presence?" Shoto expanded. When even more silence was all he received in return, Shoto placed his right hand on his chin and thought. "Am I misinterpreting the nature of your relationship with her?" "Possibly," Izuku noncommittally answered. "What brought this on?" Shoto took a minute to properly make sense of and gather his thoughts so that he could articulate the unfamiliar emotions. "Lately, I've been experiencing that sensation. With everything going on at home, I had initially thought that it was just an easy escape that I could get lost in, but I'm starting to realize that it's a little deeper than that. I felt it budding even before we left for training camp, but I've never experienced or really even seen anything resembling what I feel. I'm not very good with emotional intelligence like you are, so I figured I'd come to you about it." Izuku nodded, taking in everything he said despite how cryptic he was being, intentionally or not. "I don't know how the hell I got that designation, but thanks. Is this about Yaoyorozu?" "Yes." Izuku hummed while he figured out how to go about this discussion, and he snapped his fingers when he settled on something. "How does she make you feel?" I mean in terms that you could possibly relate to, like in comparison to family or soba. It was a shallow thread to pull, but knowing Shoto's home situation growing up, Soba was probably the only constant in his life that didn't leave a scar of some kind. She makes me feel like when Fayumi used to comfort me after a particularly hard day of training with my dad, Shoto lowly responded. She'd ice my burns and make me soba while assuring me that everything was going to be okay, despite how much I didn't believe it after Mom went to the hospital. You feel safe and secure around her, Izuku mused, helping Shoto make sense of his thoughts. Shoto nodded. She says the same. Her mom is a perfectionist, and she was really hard on her about living up to the potential that she saw for her rather than what Yaoyorozu actually desired. Shoto lowered his head a bit as a small smile found purchase on his face. We're really similar in that way. You sound really fond of her, Izuku commented with a smile. Shoto nodded, and then he took a moment to determine exactly how he wanted to phrase his next question. Where exactly do I go from here? As I said before, I'm really ignorant to matters regarding intrapersonal skills. I'm not even sure if I'm emotionally developed enough to pursue anything like this to begin with. That was certainly a great point, one that Izuku likely wasn't qualified to properly weigh in on. I can't really make that judgment call, Izuku began. With that said, if you're certain about how you feel about her, and she presumably feels similarly, I see no reason to not explore the idea, even if only cautiously at first. Cautiously? Shoto asked. Taking it slow, I suppose, Izuku clarified. This whole friendship thing is rather new to you, right? Upon receiving a nod from Shoto, he continued. Right, and infatuation is horribly complex in its own right. Best not to overcomplicate things for now. In his peripheral vision, he spotted Gyro trying to appear inconspicuous a little ways away from them. She was out of Shoto's line of sight, so he hadn't noticed, but Izuku knew that she was listening. That gave him an idea. Just keep doing what you've been doing and let things bloom as they may, Izuku advised with a smile. I have a sneaking suspicion that Yaoyorozu is going through something very similar right now. He could just barely notice Gyro nod in confirmation, and he fought off the satisfied smirk that threatened to develop. I'm pretty out of my element on that front, so that's about the best advice I can give. Thank you, nonetheless, Shoto sighed in relief. Have you ever felt anything of this sort? Izuku was silent for a long moment, and Shoto felt his curiosity crescendo. I could answer that question, Izuku carefully began, but I know about the betting pool going around for who I'll end up with by graduation. Shoto furrowed his brow. Betting pool? Another time, we'll be late if we mosey any longer, Izuku insisted and ushered his friend along towards their homeroom. Meanwhile, Gyro pulled out her phone and frantically alerted the group chat of her discovery. He knows. I believe I mentioned this already, but your ultimate goal this summer is to obtain provisional hero licenses, Aizawa lectured his class. A hero license of any kind means that you're officially responsible for human lives. The exam to receive one isn't a cakewalk, either. Only 50% of applicants actually pass the exam, and that's on a good day. Do not take this lightly. When he was certain that they had internalized the gravity of it all, he signaled for the other teachers standing outside of the classroom to enter. In walked Midnight, Cementos, and Ectoplasm, and Aizawa continued. In order to prepare you all, we'll be concentrating on something new, your ultimate moves. One brief explanation of ultimate moves by the assembled pros later. One is suited up in their costumes and gathered in Gym Gamma. Once Cementos crafted a massive, quarry-like terrain and Ectoplasm formed 18 clones to assist everyone individually. The class split up and got to work. Izuku was left standing by a concrete pillar with a clone of his teacher by his side in preparation to begin developing his ultimate move. There was one tiny problem, though. He had absolutely no idea where to start. You seem troubled, Ectoplasm noted, taking stock of the teen's blank gaze as he watched the others in action. I don't really know where to begin, Izuku admitted. My quirk is so multifaceted. I have so many options to choose from that I'm not even sure what to focus on. Ectoplasm hummed in consideration. That is a conundrum. To my understanding, your quirk allows you enhanced strength, speed, and cognition, as well as superheating, creating barriers, and forming offensive tendrils. Is that the short of it? I'm pretty much an Everman, Izuku confirmed with a nod. Is there any particular aspect of your power that is more potent than the rest? Ectoplasm asked. Izuku was about to answer, but the words died on his tongue, and he fell into deep thought. Well, there was one new development, actually. My quirk kind of evolved at training camp, as these new vents on my arm are proof of. I can access a higher level of power that would have completely torn me apart before, but I think I'll be able to manage it now, at least incrementally. Show me. Izuku nodded, and he took a deep breath. Igniting in a fiery mosaic, Izuku felt the familiar sensation of his kaleidoscopic fire glide over him. This was the easy part. Now, for the taxing part. Izuku focused, reaching inward and snatching each flame into a tight grasp before bringing everything forth in a bombastic display. The wild, intense flames of second gear blasted off of him like a towering inferno, and Ectoplasm had to take a step back from the power he felt radiating from the teen. Even a few of his classmates had to pause their training and take a gander at their class rep, and they were met with a myriad of bright, vibrant colors blooming from his form. The visual was complemented by the iridescent scarf that, true to its design, shimmered in a variety of colors alongside the flames and billowed behind him from the power of his quirk like a magnificent cape. It was a fantastically brilliant display that pretty much embodied his entire ethos as a hero. "Hey!" Aizawa barked, snapping everyone's attention away from Izuku. "The hell are you all standing around for? Get back to work." As the class dutifully and hurriedly returned to their ultimate move creations, Bakugo's eyes remained fixed on Izuku. They scanned over the fiery rainbow that was his classmate, the powerless weakling he used to stand head and shoulders above when they were children. Izuku had long since surpassed him and left him in the dust. He didn't know how to feel about that. "This is quite impressive," Ectoplasm marveled. "What can you do in this state?" "Everything," was all Izuku said in response. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and a loud, boisterous laugh filled the large gym. Aizawa groaned while Midnight and Cementos chuckled at Aizawa's aggravation. "I am here," All Might announced to the surprised class. This was the first anyone had seen of him since announcing his retirement, and he still looked no worse for wear than he did before Kamino. "To assist your training," All Might finished with a grin. "All Might," Izuku muttered with an unnervingly blank expression, at least in Ectoplasm's opinion. "Young Midoriya, you look fantastic," All Might complimented as he made his way over to the ignited teen. "All Might," Izuku shouted, and true to Ectoplasm's suspicions, the snarl facing the former no. One hero was vicious. Young Midoriya," All Might unsteadily inquired as he took a hesitant step back. The look in the boy's eyes was much too reminiscent of his master's look when he was being a little shit, as she often phrased it. He was not sure what the boy would be upset at him for. Oh dear. "I know what you did," Izuku bellowed, the flames of his quirk blasting overhead with even more vigor. Now, young Midoriya, let's talk about this." All Might shakily attempted to calm the boy, but he knew it was much too late. So he did what any of the most powerful beings on the planet would do when faced with a teenage nuke ready to blow on them in particular. He ran. "Get your ass over here." Izuku was damn near feral now, launching himself at the fleeing pro-hero and engaging in a supersonic chase around the gym. The two super-powered beings among super-powered beings were blurs to literally everyone in the gym with them, the only indicators of their locations at any given point being the periodic crash and colorful trail of fire left by their class rep. To the students from what they could even make out. Anyway, It appeared as though Izuku was keeping pace with All Might while smashing through dozens of unoccupied pillars like tissue. To the teachers, the scene was a touch more concerning, as All Might's panicked yelps sounded too genuine to be him just hamming it up for some kind of training exercise. "Should we put a stop to this?" Midnight questioned after a particular loud bang resulted in an even brighter burst of flames. Aizawa snorted. "Are you kidding? Not a chance." "But he might actually want to seriously hurt All Might," Cementos added with a tinge of worry. "I'll allow it," Aizawa maintained. In the air with the two monstrosities in question, All Might was questioning all of his life decisions that inevitably led him to this point. He was certain that if he still had one for all in its entirety within him, his master would be proudly cheering her grandson on in his attempts to catch and disembowel him. He'd also be lying if he said that he wasn't having the most fun he had had in years. The teen's pursuit was legitimately making him sweat, something only All for One and a few others that were aligned with him had ever really been able to accomplish when All Might was seriously trying. However, here he was using well over half of his power and fending off lightning-fast strikes from purple whips while airborne, only for those strikes to have been a diversion to allow the raging bull to create an orange platform and use it as a launch pad to propel himself at All Might even faster. It was the steely determination to catch and tear him limb from limb in young Midoriya's eyes that compelled All Might to create actual distance between them. Landing on the nearest pillar, All Might jumped straight up and towards the ceiling, watching the teen spear through the space he had just inhabited milliseconds prior and impacting the ground into a tight roll back to his feet. They locked eyes for a brief moment in which All Might thought he was finally safe to take a breather and re-examine the situation. Izuku did not agree with this assessment, however. The intense flames of second gear rocketed to an intensity that nearly blew anyone that hadn't quickly made themselves scarce off of their feet, and jets of fire blasted from the vents in his arms, tearing through the sleeves of his costume that hadn't yet been modified for them, lifting him off the ground, and rocketing him towards a flabbergasted All Might. The man was so unprepared for Izuku to literally fly up to his perceived safe zone that he didn't even mount a defense to the fiery uppercut that slammed into his chin. The punch blasted him through the ceiling and out of the building, creating an All Might-sized hole in the roof of Gym Gamma. 19 jaws were resting on the ground as they all stared at the hole. It would have been 20, but Ectoplasm's jaw wasn't detachable. Aizawa, on the other hand, was sporting a wicked grin and a gaze brimming with approval. "Looks like he's got an ultimate move down," Aizawa commented. As the seconds drew on, several noticed that Izuku was not in the room with them, which could only mean that he had followed All Might on his ascent. That would be confirmed a few seconds later when a rainbow comet crashed through the roof and slammed into the concrete, creating another hole in the ceiling in the process. When the dust settled, Izuku was crouching on top of All Might, his right hand pressing down on the man's cheek and his left hand clutching the hero's meaty wrist in an iron grip. If the room could somehow be even more incredulous than they were previously, this sight tipped them over the edge. "Are you satisfied now, young Midoriya?" All Might grunted from his position embedded within the concrete. "Yes," Izuku said with a content nod, and he released the man from his grasp. "Splendid." All Might's usual boisterous tone returned as he kipped up from the crater and dusted himself off like nothing happened. "We'll talk later." Izuku nodded and returned to his original place beside the ectoplasm clone he had initially been working with. All Might, on the other hand, laughed and leaped out of the gym through one of the holes in the ceiling since the impromptu chase ate through a decent chunk of his time, and he didn't yet want to reveal himself to the public. "Did Midoriya just render us all irrelevant again?" Kaminari broke the silence. "When did we get it back?" Tokoyami questioned in response. Rumi Yuzuyama was many things: an adrenaline junkie, a battle junkie, and an undercover fan of cheesy romantic comedies that no one but Ryukyu was aware of, and it would stay that way if she valued her kneecaps. One thing she was not, however, was a bureaucrat, nor was she supportive or even somewhat sympathetic to bureaucracy. particularly the ever-so-shady bureaucracy that oversaw the Japanese heroics industry. So, she was less than ecstatic to find a summons directly from the HPSC in her mailbox that requested Reed ordered her to appear in person at their headquarters in Tokyo. She was even less jazzed to be sitting in a cold meeting room at a table with Madam President of the Hero Public Safety Commission herself. She didn't know what she could possibly be needed in person, for that couldn't be articulated in a letter, phone call, email, or even one of the many fucking messengers the Commission loved to send for intimidation purposes. Not that she'd ever be intimidated by some kumquat in a suit. This woman, though, unnerved the shit out of Rumi. She always had. It was likely part of the job, but she had such a frosty, disquieting aura about her that helped her pin you down and flay your defenses with but a gaze until you felt totally exposed and at her mercy. Many suspected that it was possibly her quirk, but no one really knew what the woman's quirk even was. No one really wanted to find out either. "I'm surprised you showed up, Miss Yuzujiyama," Madam President began after a sufficiently tense few minutes of silence. "Not like I had a choice in the matter," Rumi sardonically remarked. "You're learning," she replied with a satisfied nod, facing the rabbit hero's developing glare with the same cool facade she always wore. "I have a job for you." "I'm not Hawks," Rumi spat, momentarily losing her cool at the audacity of this bitch. "You sign my paychecks after I do the heavy lifting on my own volition, and that's it. I'm not your patsy, nor your hired gun. I don't do anything for you or anyone. I'm my own woman." "I suppose that's true," Madam President sighed, her eyes closing and her hands coming together in a steeple. "You are your own woman, a confident, powerful, headstrong woman doing the best for herself." The pause that followed clued Rumi in that she was not going to like what was to come, but she had no idea what direction the conversation would go at this juncture. Madam President was the worst kind of enigma, and the woman knew it very well. Her cold, almost bored gaze rested dispassionately on Rumi, practically discarding her as nothing more than a disposable cog in the greater machine. "How many years sober has it been now?" she finally spoke up, staring the wide-eyed rabbit woman right in the eye. 5? 6? "You fucking bitch. Did I strike a nerve?" "Don't you ever fucking bring that up," Rumi growled, struggling mightily to remain in her seat at the table. "But it is a part of your story." "No," Madam President countered. "As is the expulsion from a prestigious hero school on your record for participating in illegal underground fights." Rumi forced herself to take a deep breath. They were alone in the room. No one would be able to reach them in time to stop her from flipping the table and popping the woman's head like a grape. They both knew that, but they both also knew that Rumi almost certainly wouldn't survive the immediate aftermath if she even survived the attempt at all. As Madam President's quirk was still very much a mystery, she needed to calm down. "Why am I here?" Rumi finally asked through gritted teeth. "You will be administering part of the upcoming provisional license exam alongside Gang Orca," Madam President answered succinctly. "And why would I bother mixing it up with a bunch of brats?" Rumi asked. Then her red eyes narrowed. "What's your actual game?" "You're smarter than you present yourself to be," the older woman noted, and Rumi forced herself to ignore that. "Izuku Midoriya will almost certainly be taking part, and I have no doubt that he'll make it past the first hurdle to the second half of the exam." Rumi did her level best to keep her face as neutral as possible upon hearing the boy's name come out of the woman's mouth. It was like a hex, and the mere fact that the little shit she had grown a little fond of was in the Commission's sights at all worried her to no end. Of course, displaying that would hand the Commission leverage on a silver platter, and there was no way that was ever going to happen. "Why is he important?" Rumi asked, innocuously probing for more information. "No reason in particular," Madam President dismissed, but Rumi didn't believe that for a second. "I just want you and Gang Orca to put the applicants through the ringer. Don't hold back. You want me to go all out against a bunch of hero hopefuls. I want you to separate those who are ready from those who are not." "This seems excessive." Maybe so, Madam President hummed, momentarily removing her gaze from Rumi and bringing it up to the ceiling in consideration. However, Japan has lost its top 2 heroes within the span of a week. The 2 strongest pillars of functional society were gone in an instant, one of them leaving in shame. Her steely gaze returned to the rabbit hero. We do not have time for those who are not cut out for this line of work. Japan requires the best of the best to maintain order at the present moment, and that should be reflected in the up-and-coming generation of heroes. And if I refuse? Rumi challenged. I don't recall suggesting that you had a choice in the matter, she calmly answered. Rumi scoffed and reached into her pocket, pulled out her hero license, and slammed it on the table. You're only my boss so long as I have this. Who's to say I don't walk out of this building without it and choose not to play your game entirely? Madam President's gaze did not waver for a moment, but Rumi was not deterred. What are you going to do? You going to expose my old nose candy habit? My troubled past? You going to run a smear campaign against me like you would have done for Endeavor had he not beaten you to the punch? Madam President did not immediately respond, instead closing her eyes as a lengthy exhale escaped her nostrils. When she reopened her eyes, she returned her cold, impassive stare to Rumi. I'm sorry you feel that way, Miss Uzujama. It would be a tragedy for Japan to lose such a fantastic hero. But if this is truly what you desire, then I can't stand in your way. Just be careful out there. It's a dangerous world for mutants, especially for those without a license that would allow them to legally defend themselves. The murder rates for those with mutation quirks are quite alarming, and most of those tend to go unsolved. Rumi was frozen in her seat. Madam President wasn't even trying to be subtle with that threat, but what really unnerved her was the utterly unbothered manner she said it. A callous death threat dripping in quirkism spoken so casually, it was right up the Commission's alley. In any event, the message was conveyed loud and clear. If Rumi walked out of this room right now, she wouldn't last a week before she was either killed or imprisoned for unlicensed quirk use. She would be silenced regardless, and Midoriya would still be a target for the Commission. There was absolutely no fucking way she would allow that. Fine, Rumi spat through gritted teeth, snatching her license off of the table and shoving it back into her pocket. I'll play ball. Excellent, Madam President nodded. That's all? You're dismissed. Rumi stood up from the table and briskly made her way to the door. However, she stopped when she heard the other woman call out again. One more thing. Mirko, Madam President uttered her codename for the first time that entire meeting. You were correct earlier when you said that you weren't Hawks. Hawks is irreplaceable. Remember that. Rumi could not get out of that fucking building fast enough. Izuku, flanked by Ida and Ochako, neared the development studio after their rather eventful training session. Izuku's costume hadn't been updated to account for his new physical characteristics, and he knew exactly the person to call upon to fix that. As Ochako was excitedly chatting up Ida about the progress she was making, Izuku's arms lit up with green fire upon reaching the door of the development studio, knowing exactly what was sure to come. Just as he predicted, an explosion blew the heavy, metal door from its hinges, only to be snatched out of the air by Izuku's right arm as he caught a pink-haired missile with his left. Sup, Izuku greeted the ambitious inventor as she shook the stars out of her eyes and looked up to see who caught her. Oh, Muscles, she preened. You're alive. Yeah, Izuku chuckled. Why wouldn't I be? You never know, the villains could have switched you with a clone to throw the heroes off their trail, Mei hypothesized before carefully studying Izuku. You're not a clone, right? I don't think so, Izuku responded, but he wasn't quite sure of himself. If he actually was a clone meant to believe that he was the real deal, then he wouldn't really know the difference, so he couldn't possibly answer that question with 100% certainty. In the apartment several cities over that had been dubbed the lair of anti-villains by Spinner, twice sneezed while Tamira was outlining the details of their first official mark as a rebranded organization, the Creature Rejection Clan. Best not to think about it too hard, Izuku settled on. May nodded, and then her voice became hushed. You'll never believe what that bonehead, All Might, did. Trust me, I'm well aware, Izuku sighed. Then he gave May a curious look. How did you find out? From the horse's mouth, May answered, and she gestured over to a bandaged Melissa hard at work on a red gauntlet. Melissa, Ochako called out in surprise and joy to see her friend from my island. Melissa was jolted out of the zone she was in and frantically looked around. When her eyes settled on the new arrivals, she relaxed and she beamed. Hi, everyone. What are you doing all the way in Japan? Ochako asked as the trio entered the lab. Melissa's smile fell, and Ochako immediately understood. You don't have to answer. I'm sorry for asking. No, it's fine, Melissa assured her with a weak smile. I transferred to UA. Izuku was already aware of this as Melissa had already told him when she visited him in the hospital. But this was news to Ochako and Ida. You'll be attending UA in the support department, I presume? Ida asked her. Sort of, Melissa sheepishly replied. I'm a dual course student. Oh, are you doing support and business? Ochako wondered. She knew Melissa was loaded, or her father was, at least, so perhaps she was trying to ensure she kept that wealth. No, Melissa sighed. Support and heroics. The two teens were struck silent at that. They were taken completely off guard by the admission, but their thoughts went in vastly different directions. On the one hand, Ochako was eyeing the gauntlet on the table and wondered if Melissa was going to go the armored hero route that used a bunch of powerful support tech, like air jet. That would be pretty fucking rad. Ida, on the other hand, Forgive me, but I thought you were quirkless, Ida carefully phrased, earning a side-eyed glance from Ochako and a chuckle from Melissa. Ida was trepidatious about the idea of a quirkless person becoming a pro-hero. Thinking back to what someone as capable and as his brother experienced at the hands of Stain, and what someone as absurdly powerful as Midoriya went through with the League of Villains, it just felt like much too dangerous of a prospect to endeavor in. Hell, he wouldn't even advise people with powerful quirks to jump into heroics willy-nilly. Anyone's life can end very abruptly. Yeah, I thought so, too, Melissa muttered before her index finger emitted a dull, red glow, and she pressed a deep indentation into the heavy-duty steel work table, shocking Ochako and Ida. You're a late bloomer, like Midoriya, Ida noted with awe. I suppose it makes sense that exceptionally powerful or unstable quirks would take a much longer time to manifest than what's typical. Yeah, let's go with that, Melissa agreed. Unbeknownst to her, Izuku was having similar thoughts about his own late bloomer status. Where's Power Loader? Izuku asked, moving the subject away from Melissa's new quirk status, and she sent him a thankful look. Oh, he's sleeping the alcohol off, May answered without a second thought. The three WANA students were struck silent. No one could have possibly expected that response. What? Ochako finally squeaked. It was Melissa that answered this time. His exact words were, a Hatsune Midoriya duo is bad enough, but I cannot handle 3 support gremlins at once. I don't really blame him, in all honesty. Fair, Izuku nodded, as well. I'm still banned from being in here unsupervised after the nail clippers fiasco. Nail clippers? Both Ochako and Melissa asked in confusion. Long story, Izuku waved it away, and just then there was groaning accompanying by shuffling from a desk in the back corner of the lab. Ugh, my head, Power Loader muttered as he blearily took in the scene. When his eyes landed on Izuku smiling pleasantly at him with May grinning manically to his side, he paled. Got him, Nit. Power Loader, I've come to bargain, Izuku happily declared and made his way towards the frightened teacher. You keep that evil away from me, the man rebuked, retreating even further behind his desk. I just need an update to the sleeves of my costume, Izuku insisted. I had a bit of a quirk evolution, so I'll need shorter gauntlets and vented sleeves. That's it? Power Loader tentatively questioned. MHM, Izuku confirmed. Meanwhile, Ochako was covering her mouth and struggling to keep in her giggle fit at the interaction. That is doable, Power Loader acquiesced. I'll even allow Hatsum and Shield to put some eyes on it for a few other perspectives, provided you three don't go overboard and commit any more war crimes. Deal, Izuku assented after a moment of thought. Any more? Ida thought in shock. Izuku turned to Melissa and shot her a grin as white flames bloomed in his hair. So, how much of your tech were you able to smuggle off of Island? Melissa smirked in return. Enough to get me a life sentence if I'm ever extradited. Luckily, they don't know that any of these babies exist because I worked on them in secret in lieu of sleep. They'll never know what they're missing. Bitchin', let's get to work. Chikuchi Tojike sighed as she placed the last box down in her room. Running a hand through her dark brown hair and across the length of her short ponytail, she sat on the barren bed and stared at the equally barren wall, save for a few of her plants lining the top of her dresser that she hadn't yet moved to the window. This was her life for the foreseeable future, and she wasn't sure if she should have been disappointed or thankful. She was at least happy to be away from home. Thinking about home was such a mood killer that she endeavored to do so as little as possible during her stay on U.S. campus. She was finally away from the cold indifference that she felt from her parents for the better part of the last decade or so, and she could spend even more time with her friends. That was always a blessing. Friends. Her friends were wonderful. Not everyone in her class was particularly receptive to her at the start, and she couldn't say she was terribly surprised. None of them were outright dickheads to her barring a few, but she did feel the pitying glances she'd receive and hated the awkward half-stepping people did when talking about things regarding quirks around her. It wasn't anything she hadn't experienced for most of her life, but it was still annoying as all hell. Luckily, she had people who were not only tolerant, but treated her like any other person without having their arm twisted. She felt her phone vibrating in her pocket, and upon retrieving her phone, she saw that she received a text from one of them in their group chat, Hitoshi Shinso. Purple Insomniac, Platinum, you finished moving in yet? Platinum, yeah, just finished. Purple Insomniac, why did you sleep here last night when you weren't even finished moving? Platinum, didn't really want to be at home. I doubt my parents would have kept their desire to finally be rid of me to themselves. Didn't want to deal with all of that. Purple Insomniac, understandable. She sighed again and put her phone down. At first, Shinso was kind of an asshole, but he was an asshole to everyone, so she didn't take it personally. She was a bit put off by his insecurity about his quirk, though, but she had dealt with similar, albeit very different things said to her and about her growing up. It was the insistence that super powerful quirks were overrated and only got people perks they never actually earned that irritated her, though. He wasn't entirely wrong, but at least he had a quirk to speak of. No, she shouldn't think like that. She shouldn't minimize anyone's struggle. His experience was equally valid. It was simply different from her own. Her phone vibrated again, and she saw that it was a message to the group chat from her other friend, Tsutsutaka Agoyamato. Crimson Chin, Platinum will throw you a finally away from home party. Purple Insomniac, Crimson Chin, you could plan every detail of the party yourself, and you'd still be late for spending too much time on your shitty pompadour. Crimson Chin, don't hate me because I'm beautiful. Maybe if you did something about that yee-yee-ass haircut, you wouldn't be so maidenless. Tojike couldn't fight the snorts that escaped her, and those snorts quickly became chuckles which eventually snowballed into audible laughter. She really adored her friends. Not for the first time that day, Toshinori was nervous. Coincidentally, the very same person that made him nervous that morning was the one doing so again at that moment. The skinny blonde awkwardly fiddled with his hands in his spot on the couch in one of the teacher's lounges with Izuku sitting on the couch across from him. The stern-faced teen had not said anything yet, leaving Toshinori to squirm in the impending conversation. After another minute of this eternal, torturous silence, Toshinori opted to take the reins of the interaction. So, You passed on the quirk, Izuku interrupted, his stern visage remaining stock still. Toshinori sighed and nodded. I did. Why? I didn't have a choice. Izuku's gaze hardened ever so slightly. You most certainly did. I mean, isn't that one of the core principles of One for All? Yes, Toshinori conceded with another sigh. There's more to this than just that. Young Midoriya, I passed on One for All to her in the event that All for One survived the battle and I did not. Izuku's eyes narrowed, and his gaze pierced through the former no. One hero. And she would have just been forced to pick up the slack after that, huh? I didn't have any other options, young Midoriya, Toshinori rebutted, conviction lining his tone. You were kidnapped and in that man's clutches. I couldn't be certain if he hadn't already stolen your quirk, or if you were even alive at all. Toshinori momentarily paused, and the following silence allowed Izuku to let his reasoning marinate. Then, Toshinori made direct eye contact with Izuku for his next words. There needed to be someone else around to protect the peace and take him down for good in the event that neither you nor I could do it. Any prepared response or train of thought Izuku might have had was completely derailed upon hearing that declaration. He ran the statement back through his mind several times, going over every word, every syllable, and even every letter. There were only so many ways his statement could have been interpreted, and all of them insisted that All Might believed that Izuku Midoriya could take down All for One likely after years of growing and training, but still. Izuku struggled to find any words. You thought I could do it? Toshinori nodded with a smile. Then he ran a hand through his mess of blonde hair. In a perfect world, I would have never had to pass on One for All. You would be powerful enough to spearhead and lead a new generation of pillars to hold up society, and the tumultuous legacy of One for All could finally rest for good. Even if you didn't want to become the new symbol of peace, everything would be okay because there didn't need to be another symbol of peace. They'd have you and everyone else you have and will build up around you. Society would be in safe, capable hands. Well, that completely spelled out All Might's true thoughts about him. He had such faith in him that he truly was content with not having a successor for his storied quirk, simply letting Izuku take the reins of protecting society with his own power. Alas, there was the obvious snag in that plan. And then I was kidnapped. Toshinori grimly nodded. Yes, and I unfortunately couldn't take any chances. Well, fuck, Izuku said the only thing that came to mind in that moment, garnering a snort from the older man. The silver lining in all of this is that All for One is gone for good, Toshinori remarked with a satisfied smile, but when he saw the consternation growing in Izuku's expression, his smile dropped. He's gone, right? I'm not so certain about that, Izuku muttered. Explain, Toshinori said, his tone deadly serious. The death god inhabiting my quirk told me that All for One's soul was fragmented when it was finally consumed, and the quirk he had with him when he died wasn't the original, it was just a copy. Izuku explained, and both of their expressions grew progressively darker as he spoke. In other words, a piece of his soul is still somewhere out there, likely in the form of his original quirk that may or may not be inhabiting someone else already. So, that means that there's already someone running around with the original version of All for One, or another vessel is being prepped for the vestige of All for One to take over. Toshinori felt the remains of One for All course through him, slowly bulking him up in his loose, black suit until All Might stood imposingly before Izuku. Then Melissa needs to be prepared for when the day comes that he finally returns. Absolutely not, All Might. Blood sprayed from the blonde's mouth, and All Might vanished in a poof, leaving a confused and incredulous Toshinori in his place. Excuse me? Izuku's stone-cold gaze pinned Toshinori to the couch, and he couldn't help but feel that Izuku had picked up way too much from his mother. You are not forcing this responsibility onto Melissa, Izuku declared, and his narrowed, emerald glare dared the man to say anything about it. That girl has more than enough to deal with already. and a generations-long prophecy of battling the ultimate evil does not need to be added to her plate. Toshinori would not back down, though. I explained everything about my quirk and its history to Melissa before I asked if she would accept it. She knew about everything going into it, even the possibility that she'd have to defeat All for One if I died in Kamino. I didn't pressure her to take any of it on. Izuku also refused to back down. You propositioned your quirkless niece into accepting a power far beyond anyone's wildest imaginations with a known possibility that you wouldn't make it out alive regardless of her answer. That's inherently fucking pressuring her, all might. Toshinori couldn't respond to that. The boy wasn't wrong, not by a long shot. However, Toshinori made his decision based on the information that was available and the options presented at that time. It was simply making the best of a bad situation. You're right, Toshinori sighed. But, as I said before, I had absolutely no other options. Izuku sighed this time. Yeah, I suppose you didn't. The two sat in silence with the ideological impasse they had come to. Truthfully speaking, Izuku didn't blame the man at all. He did what was best for the future of Japan given the circumstances, and while Izuku wasn't particularly happy that it had to come to this point after the discussion they had on the plane, it was Izuku that was kidnapped and knocked down the dominoes that led them to their current situation in the first place. That would certainly be another fun thing to think about every night. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and in stepped the subject of their discussion in the flesh. Melissa pensively surveyed the room, unsure as to what she wanted to say now that she was in the room. How much did you hear? Toshinori asked, suspecting that Melissa was pressed up against the door and eavesdropping. Everything, she admitted, and she turned her focus to Izuku. I appreciate your concern, Izuku, truly. I'm really glad that you care about me enough to be worried on my behalf. She sighed, and resolve bled into her tone. Still, it was my decision to accept the power knowing what was potentially to come, and I stand by it. If All for One ever returns, I want to be ready for him. I'm going to be ready for him. Izuku could not argue with the resolve in both her tone and her expression. Not that he particularly wanted to. What was done, and the only thing to do now was to move forward and prepare as best as they could. You two probably have stuff you need to discuss, so I'll be off, Izuku said, bidding the both of them a quick goodbye and leaving the room to them. There was actually something I needed to talk to you about, Melissa began, taking Izuku's vacated spot on the opposite couch. It happened this morning. What is it? Toshinori inquired, having an idea as to what it could have possibly been. I met the vestiges. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Deku Unleashed God-like Quirk That Surpassed All. I hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. A big shout-out to DripBayless for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile on FanfictionNet for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to What If Deku 2.0 for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we're always excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you guys in the next video.